on the 6th of April, 1893, an old man named Wilford Woodruff stood inside a building of solid gray stone in Salt Lake City and spoke the words that finished it. The cornerstone of that building had been laid 40 years earlier, almost to the day, on the 6th of April, 1853. The architect who drew every line of it, a self-taught craftsman named Truman O. Angell, had carried the design in his head for most of his working life and had died before he ever saw it dedicated. The stone in its walls had been torn out of a mountain 20 miles to the southeast, in Little Cottonwood Canyon, by men whose names the record mostly did not keep, under a quarry superintendent named James C. Livingston, and dragged across the valley one enormous block at a time. I went looking for the story of how a few thousand people, in a remote desert valley, 1,000 miles from the nearest city, with no machines and almost no money, decided to build the hardest possible thing out of the hardest possible stone, and then spent 40 years doing it by hand. What I found is one of the most stubborn feats of pure muscle and patience in American history, and almost no one outside Utah knows how close it came to never being finished at all. So let me show you what it actually took, and why these people would not stop. To understand why anyone would attempt something this slow and this heavy, you have to understand where they were standing. In the summer of 1847, a wagon company of Latter-day Saint pioneers came down out of the Wasatch Range and stopped at the edge of a dry basin beside a salt lake, more than 1,000 miles from the settled cities of the eastern states. They had been driven west out of Illinois and Missouri, and they had come to this valley precisely because no one else wanted it. It was high desert. The soil was hard, the streams were small, and the nearest hardwood forests and the nearest stone yards and the nearest railroads were all impossibly far away. They had crossed the plains with handcarts and ox wagons, and most of what they owned they had carried on their own backs. And within 4 days of arriving, their leader, a blunt and practical man named Brigham Young, walked out onto a patch of open ground, planted his cane in the dirt, and said that here they would build a temple. They had no sawmill yet worth the name. They had no quarry. They had no money. They had a desert and a decision. There is a reason Brigham Young reached for permanence so fiercely, and it sits in the years just behind that wagon company. These people had built before, and they had lost everything they built. Back east, in Ohio, they had raised a temple at Kirtland and then been driven away from it. In Missouri, they had begun temple sites and been forced off the land before they could finish. And in Illinois, they had poured years of labor into a great temple at Nauvoo, only to be driven out of that city too. 2 years after they fled Nauvoo, in October of 1848, an arsonist set fire to the temple they had abandoned and gutted it, and what little remained of its walls was finally thrown down by a tornado in May of 1850. So when these same people came down into the Salt Lake Valley and Brigham Young marked off a temple site within 4 days, they were not starting fresh. They were people who had built holy things 3 times and watched them burn or be torn down or be left behind. This time they wanted something no fire and no mob and no storm could ever take from them. This time they would build out of the mountain itself. For the first few years, the decision sat mostly as a marked-off square of dirt, while the people fought simply to survive. They dug irrigation ditches and planted crops and watched crickets nearly destroy the first harvest. But the idea of the building never left them, and in the early 1850s, they finally began. On the 14th of February 1853, they dedicated the ground, and on the 6th of April that year, Brigham Young presided as the cornerstones were laid. The man given the job of designing the thing was Truman O. Angell. And here is the first detail I keep coming back to, because it tells you how far outside the normal world this project was. Angell was not a trained architect. He was a carpenter and a joiner by trade who had learned building the way a frontier craftsman learns it, with his hands on real jobs. The church would later send him across the ocean to study the great cathedrals of Europe so that he could understand how master masons had raised stone to that height with hand tools and bring that knowledge back to a desert that had none of it. He drew a building with 6 tall towers, and he laid out what were called course charts, sheet after sheet telling the cutters at the building site the exact rough dimensions of every single block that would ever go into the walls. He was drawing a 40-year machine made of paper and stone, and he would not live to see it run. The hardest question, before a single wall could rise, was what to build it out of. The valley had plenty of adobe, the sun-dried mud brick that most of the early settlement was made from, and they tried it. But mud brick was never going to carry a building meant to stand for centuries. There was sandstone nearer to hand, in the canyons close to the city, and they tried that too. They actually began the foundation in sandstone, hauling the first footing stones down from Red Butte Canyon, but Brigham Young wanted permanence above everything else. He kept asking, in effect, what is the best stone we can find in these mountains? And the answer lay up a hard canyon 20 miles to the southeast. In Little Cottonwood Canyon, there were enormous outcrops of a pale, dense, gray rock. To the eye, it looks like granite, and almost everyone has always called it granite, though a geologist will tell you it is technically a quartz monzonite. The distinction does not matter to the men who had to cut it. What mattered was that it was about as hard and as durable as building stone gets, and it was sitting in a mountain 20 miles from where they needed it, with no road, no rail, and no machine to move it. So the work split into two enormous halves, the cutting and the carrying, and both were done by hand. Up in the canyon, the quarrymen attacked the rock the way men had attacked hard stone for centuries. They drilled lines of holes into the granite by hand, one man turning and striking a steel drill bit, while the rock gave up a little dust at a time. Into those holes they drove black powder, or wedges of iron, the old plug and feather method, splitting a block free along a planned line. A loose face of mountain became, after hours of drilling and packing and splitting, a single rough rectangular block. The early blocks ran around 2,000 to 6,000 pounds. Later, as the work grew bolder, some of the stones they moved weighed 10 and even 12 tons. Every one of them had to come out of the canyon, down to the valley floor, and across 20 miles of open country to the building site they called the Temple Block. That carry was its own ordeal, and it is the part that still stops me. There was no railroad to the canyon in those early years. There were oxen and wagons and men. A team of oxen would be hitched to a low, heavy wagon. A single great block of granite would be loaded onto it, and the team would begin the slow grind across the valley. A round trip from the quarry to the Temple Block and back took about 4 days for one stone. Think about that arithmetic for a moment. One block, 4 days, a building that would need thousands upon thousands of blocks. At that pace, the walls did not so much rise as accumulate, stone by stone, season by season, the way a glacier moves, too slow to watch and impossible to stop. The teamsters walked beside their oxen in the heat and the dust of the valley summers and the deep cold of the canyon winters, and the granite came down out of the Wasatch one agonizing wagon load at a time. They knew the haul was the bottleneck, and they tried hard to beat it. One of the strangest chapters in the whole story is the attempt to float the stone. Beginning around 1854, and again around 1855, the settlers tried to dig a canal that would carry water from the cottonwood streams and let them float the heavy granite blocks down toward the city on barges, the way the great canals back east moved freight. It was a sound idea on paper. It had been the idea, more or less, behind every successful piece of American stone-moving infrastructure of that era. But the ground in the valley would not cooperate. The canal they dug simply would not hold water. It drained away into the porous soil faster than they could fill it, and after 2 attempts the whole canal scheme was abandoned. The granite would have to keep coming by ox team until something better arrived, and the only thing that could be better was a railroad that did not yet exist anywhere near them. If the idea of moving that much stone by hand is the kind of history you came here for, then the story that started all of it, the Erie Canal that proved a young country, could move mountains of earth and stone with nothing but shovels, wheelbarrows, and patience, is now a book, the full illustrated account of how it was dug across New York by hand. The men in Utah were trying to do with a canyon what the men in New York had done with a wilderness. You can scan the code on your screen and start reading it tonight. Down at the Temple Block, the other half of the work was going on, and it was just as demanding. As each rough block arrived after its 4-day journey, it went into the hands of the stonecutters, the masons who turned a crude wedge of mountain into a finished piece of a wall. At any given time, there were somewhere between 50 and 80 stonecutters working at the Temple Block, and their job was precision at a scale that is hard to picture now. They worked from Angel's course charts. Each stone had to be dressed to an exact face, squared and trued so that it would seat against its neighbors with the thin, tight joints that a great masonry wall demands. They cut it with hammers and chisels and steel points, by eye and by straight edge, hour after hour, the constant ringing of steel on stone hanging over the block like weather. A single large stone could take a skilled cutter days to finish. and these were walls of real mass. At the base, the granite walls of the temple run as much as 9 feet thick. 9 feet. A man could lie down across the foot of that wall and not reach from one face to the other. Even at the very top, more than 200 feet up, those walls are still 6 feet through. The foundation beneath them was laid 16 feet thick, a buried raft of granite built to carry the whole mountain of stone above it. The finished building would stand about 210 feet to the base of the figure on its tallest eastern spire, and about 204 feet at the center of the 3 western towers. The highest point of the tallest spire reaches about 223 feet, a stone mountain raised by hand in a desert. And the cutting was not only the plain square blocks of the wall. Truman O. Angle's design covered the temple in carved symbolic stones, and every one of them had to be shaped from the same brutal quartz monzonite by the same hand tools. Set into the 50 great buttresses that ring the building are rows of carved earthstones, each one weighing more than 6,000 pounds, better than 3 tons of granite cut into a single ornamental shape. Above them run 50 carved moonstones showing the phases of the moon, then a band of carved sunstones, and high on the towers, 68 star stones. Picture a cutter standing at the block with a hammer and a chisel, working a 3-ton piece of the hardest building stone in the territory into the precise curve of a crescent moon, knowing that if his hand slipped near the end, he had wasted weeks and 3 tons of granite that had cost an ox team 4 days to deliver. That is the level of patience this building demanded, not once, but on hundreds of stones for 40 years. And I want to be honest about who did the lifting, because this is where the real weight of the story lives. The labor force that built this temple was not a hired army of professionals with a payroll and a schedule. A great deal of it was what they called tithing labor, ordinary members of the community giving days and weeks of their own muscle as their contribution, taking their turn at the quarry or the hall or the cutting yard, and then going home to their farms. Many of the steady hands were immigrants, young men who had crossed the ocean from Europe, drawn by their faith, and put straight to work on the stone. Whole families came up to the quarry villages in the warm months. The quarries in Little Cottonwood grew into rough little settlements of their own, with their own cookhouses and bunk rooms and the constant sound of drilling. By the spring of 1873, the man overseeing that force of cutters and teamsters in the canyon was James C. Livingston, managing the crews tearing stone out of the mountain for the temple. For the men under him, the drillers and the powder men and the teamsters who walked the 4-day road, the record usually kept no individual names at all. It kept crew counts and wagon counts and tonnage. The ledger, as it so often does with the men who do the heaviest work, gives no name, only a number. But every clean joint and every squared face in that building is the signature of a man who has otherwise vanished from the record entirely. Now hold all of that effort in your mind, the canyon, the powder, the 4-day haul, the 50 to 80 cutters, and understand that within a few years of starting, the entire project was buried in the ground and made to disappear. This is the turn in the story that almost no one expects. In the middle of the 1850s, the relationship between the settlers in Utah and the government of the United States had grown tense and suspicious, and in 1857 it broke open into what became known as the Utah War. The federal government sent an army west toward the Salt Lake Valley to install a new territorial governor and assert control over a people it did not trust. To the settlers who had been driven out of 2 states already, the approach of a United States Army looked like the old persecution coming again with bayonets. Brigham Young prepared the people to abandon and even burn their own city rather than let it be taken, and the half-built temple foundation, the most precious thing they had begun, was suddenly a target sitting in the open. So they hid it. They covered the entire foundation over with earth, and then they graded and raked the lot until it looked like nothing at all, like an ordinary plowed field waiting for a crop. An army marching past would see a patch of farmland and a town, and never know that beneath that field lay the footings of the building these people had given years of their lives to begin. For a time, the great work simply ceased to exist, on purpose, hidden under the dirt of the valley. The army came, the crisis eventually cooled, and the soldiers did not destroy the city. But when the people finally uncovered their buried foundation, around 1861, they made a bitter discovery. The sandstone footings, the early foundation they had laid before the burial, had cracked. The weight of the earth piled over them, or the freezing and thawing, or flaws in the sandstone itself, had broken the very base the whole building was meant to stand on. And a building of solid granite, 200 feet tall and walls 9 feet thick, cannot stand on a cracked foundation. So Brigham Young made one of the hardest decisions in the whole 40 years. On the first day of January, 1862, he gave the order to tear the cracked sandstone foundation out completely and rebuild it from the ground up in solid granite, 16 feet thick. They were going to undo years of finished work and start the base of the temple over in the hardest stone they had, hauled 4 days at a time from the canyon. There would be no second foundation crisis. The new base was a buried slab of granite, deep enough and broad enough to carry a building of stone 200 feet tall without ever cracking again. And laying it meant moving an enormous tonnage of quartz monzonite into a hole in the ground before a single visible wall could rise. Sit with what that meant for the people who had laid that first foundation. Some of them had given their labor to footings that were now condemned, dug up and thrown away. The work of rebuilding moved with the same glacial slowness as everything else, because the granite still had to come the same 20 miles by the same ox teams. The walls of the rebuilt temple did not even reach ground level, did not so much as clear the surface of the lot, until the end of the building season in 1867. 14 years after the cornerstone had been laid with such hope in 1853, after a war scare and a burial and a foundation torn out and redone, the building was finally, just barely, level with the ground. 14 years to get to zero. If you have ever wondered how badly a group of people can want a thing, that is your answer. They had spent more than a decade of hand labor and had, in a literal sense, nothing yet standing to show for it, and they kept going. If you are new here, and this is the kind of history you have been looking for, the quiet engineering and the named men and the unnamed thousands behind the things we walk past, take a second to subscribe, or to join the channel as a member for early access to every new film. It is the simplest way to keep work like this going. The thing that finally changed the arithmetic was the same thing that changed everything else in the American West. The railroad. The transcontinental line was completed in 1869 just to the north of the valley, and Brigham Young had seen it coming and understood exactly what it would mean for his stone. If the rails could reach the granite, the 4-day ox haul could die, and so they built toward the canyon. The narrow-gauge Wasatch and Jordan Valley Railway pushed out from the settlement at Sandy toward the quarries, and around the 28th of April, 1873, it reached the Granite at a little station they simply called Granite. The effect was transformative. A journey that had taken an ox team about 4 days for a single block was suddenly cut to about half a day by rail. The bottleneck that had strangled the work for 2 decades loosened almost overnight. Blocks that would have crawled across the valley now rode it. The walls, which had taken 14 years just to reach the ground, finally began to climb at something closer to the pace the builders had always dreamed of, and climb they did. Through the 1870s and into the 1880s, the grey granite walls rose course by course above the temple block, wrapped in a growing lattice of timber scaffolding, the 6 towers beginning to take their shape against the desert sky. As the walls climbed past the reach of a man on the ground, the builders raised the heavy stones on derricks and timber hoists worked by hand and by animal power, lifting blocks that ran to several tons up onto the rising courses and easing them into their exact seats. The cutting never stopped. The constant ring of chisels at the block, the dressing of every stone to Angel's charts, went on year after year. The 6 great towers were carried deliberately to 2 different heights. The 3 towers on the east end were built about 6 feet taller than the 3 on the west, a difference written into Angel's plan so that even the height of the stone carried meaning. The main walls of the building were finally finished around 1885, more than 30 years after the cornerstone. Truman O. Angle himself, the man who had drawn the whole thing, worked on as the architect for decade after decade, with assistants like William Ward beside him in the early years, and he died in 1887, 6 years before the building he had designed would be finished. The man who imagined the 6 spires never stood beneath the completed 6 spires. The final stretch of the architectural work passed to Joseph Don Carlos Young, who carried it through to the dedication. That is the cost of building at the speed of stone and muscle. You hand the work to the next pair of hands, and you trust them to finish what your generation could only begin. By the early 1890s, the walls were nearly up, and the towers were, reaching their full height, and the people prepared for the moment that would crown 40 years of labor. The capstone, the final stone at the very top of the tallest eastern spire, was set on the 6th of April, 1892. And here the old desert world and the brand new electric age touched for a single moment. The aging church president, Wilford Woodruff, did not climb 200 feet of stone to set that capstone by hand. He pressed an electric switch at the ground, closing a circuit that ran an electric motor far above, and the great stone was eased into its final place by that current, while an enormous crowd, said to number in the tens of thousands, watched from below and roared. On that capstone they raised a statue, a figure of a herald angel covered in gold leaf, sculpted by an artist named Cyrus Dallin. The building that had been started with ox teams and black powder and a cane stuck in the dirt was topped off by the flip of an electric switch. The two ends of the 19th century met on that spire. There was still a year of finishing work to do inside, the long, careful completion of the interior overseen in the final stretch by a builder named John R. Winder. But the great stone shell, the 40-year labor, was done. And on the 6th of April, 1893, Wilford Woodruff dedicated the temple. The date was not an accident. It was exactly 40 years to the day after Brigham Young had presided over the laying of the cornerstone in 1853. 40 years. 2 full generations of cutters and teamsters and masons. Men who had been boys swinging at drill steel in the canyon when the work began were old. Men or gone when it ended. Brigham Young himself, who had planted his cane and named the spot, had died back in 1877, 16 years before the dedication, having driven the project through its hardest decades and through the foundation crisis, but never seeing it crowned. The building outlived almost everyone who had decided to build it. When I step back from all the dates and tonnages, what stays with me is the sheer disproportion of the thing. This was not a wealthy empire raising a monument out of surplus. This was a community of farmers and immigrants in a high desert, perpetually short of money, often short of food, repeatedly afraid for their own safety, who chose to pour 40 years of their hardest physical labor into a single building of the most difficult stone they could find. They could have built in adobe and finished in 5 years. They could have built in the soft sandstone close to hand. Instead, they went 20 miles up a canyon for a stone, so hard it fought every drill, and they hauled it 4 days at a time, and when their first foundation failed, they tore it out and did it again in that same impossible granite. Every reasonable shortcut was available to them, and they refused all of them because the whole point was permanence. They were building something they intended to outlast them by centuries, and they were willing to spend their own single lifetimes as the raw material for it. The methods they used were almost entirely the methods of the ancient world: drill and wedge to split the stone, black powder to break the ledge, ox and wagon to move the load, hammer and chisel to dress the face. The only genuinely modern tools in the entire 40-year span arrived at the very end: the railroad that finally beat the haul, and the electric motor that set the final stone. Everything in between, the millions of foot-pounds of effort that actually raised those walls, came from human and animal muscle, exactly as it would have at a medieval cathedral or an ancient quarry. They studied the cathedrals of Europe on purpose, sending Angel across the ocean to learn how the old masters had done it, and then they reproduced that lost craft of monumental hand-cut stonework in a corner of North America that had been empty wilderness within living memory. There is something almost out of time about it. A 19th century desert community building a 14th century cathedral with their bare hands, and finishing it the same decade the electric light and the skyscraper were being born back east. And the building is still there. The walls those cutters dressed to Angel's charts still stand exactly where the Teamster's granite was set, the quartz monzonite still pale and hard against the Salt Lake City sky, the 6 towers still holding the line they were given in the 1850s. Up in Little Cottonwood Canyon you can still find the quarry, the great scarred faces of rock where the blocks were split free, the leftover stones too flawed to use, the drill marks where a man stood turning steel by hand 170 years ago. There is a trail there now that walks you past it. You can put your hand on the same granite and look down the same 20 miles of valley that every one of those blocks traveled, 4 days at a time, behind a team of straining oxen. The work did not vanish into legend. It is sitting out there in the open, in stone, exactly as hard to argue with as it ever was. I think about what that building really represents, and I keep landing on the same idea. we tend to measure great construction in speed and in money and in machinery. We celebrate the bridge thrown up in 2 years, the tower raised by a crane in 18 months. By every one of those measures, this temple is a failure. It took 40 years, it bankrupted patience. It was hidden in the dirt, torn up, and started over. It killed and injured an unknown number of men whose names were never written down, and it was finished by people who had been infants when it began. And yet it is one of the most completely realized buildings, the 19th century, produced anywhere in America, finished exactly as it was first drawn, in the hardest stone available, with no compromise of the original vision, across 2 full generations. It is the opposite of everything our age values about building, and it shames almost all of it. Now, I want to be careful and honest about the legacy, because the easy version of this story flattens it. This was a religious building, raised by a religious people for religious reasons, and I have told it as what it plainly also is, one of the great feats of pioneer engineering and stone labor in the history of this country. Those 2 things are not in conflict. The masons who cut the stones of the cathedrals at Chartres and at Cologne were building for their faith too, and we rightly study their work as among the supreme achievements of human craftsmanship, without that ever being in doubt. The men who drilled the granite in Little Cottonwood Canyon and the teamsters who walked it 4 days across the valley belong in exactly that company. What they did with drill steel and black powder and ox teams in a desert in 40 years stands beside any hand-built monument on the continent, which leaves me with a harder question, and I am going to hand it to you. We assume, almost without thinking, that real progress means going faster, that the measure of a civilization is how quickly it can build. The people who raised this temple believed close to the opposite. They believed the measure of a thing was whether it would still be standing in 500 years, and they were willing to spend 40 years and 2 generations of their own lives to make sure of it. So here is what I keep wondering, and I would genuinely like to know what you think. If a community today were handed the same task, a building of solid hand-cut mountain granite, no shortcuts, no substitutes, hauled 20 miles by the slowest means available, finished exactly as designed no matter how long it took, do you believe any group of us still has the patience to begin a project we know we will not live to see completed? The pioneers in that valley did it without hesitation. I am not at all sure we could. I have my own answer, and I suspect it is not a flattering one. I would like to hear yours down in the comments, because I do not think the question is anywhere near as simple as we would like to pretend. If you want the deeper origin of all of this, the moment American hand-built infrastructure first proved that ordinary people with shovels could move the immovable, the full illustrated story of the Erie Canal is waiting behind the code on your screen. Scan it, pick it up, and thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. I will see you at the next one.